Hello again. In this set of video lectures, we'll be covering coding diseases of the circulatory system. This includes hypertension, heart failure, and other related conditions. Okay, again, we're coding diseases of the circulatory system. These all fall into code categories I00 through I99. These include such things as acute rheumatic fever, falling into code categories I00 through I02, chronic rheumatic heart diseases I05 through I09, hypertensive diseases falling into I10 through I11A or I1A, excuse me, and ischemic heart diseases falling into code categories I20 through I25. Pulmonary heart disease and disease of the pulmonary circulation, I26 through I28, and other forms of heart disease, I30 through I5A. These also cover cerebral vascular diseases, I60 through I69, I70 through I79 includes diseases of arteries, arterioles, capillaries, I80 through 89, diseases of the veins, lymphatic system, lymph nodes, not elsewhere classified. And then I95 through I99, other diseases of the circulatory system. An important concept to understand when you're looking at coding the acute myocardial infarctions, otherwise known as heart attacks, is the ST elevation, the STEMI. And the ST segment with the STEMI is elevated in one or several of the EKG leads. A non-ST elevation myocardial infarction is referred to as an NSTEMI. This may be described as non-Q wave, subendocardial, non-transmural, and involves less than the full thickness of the myocardial wall. Categories I21, I22, and I23 for acute myocardial infarction are used for 4 weeks or less from the onset. Codes from category I22, subsequent acute myocardial infarction, must be used with a code from category I21, ST elevation, myocardial infarction, and non-ST elevation, myocardial infarction. And again, important point on this slide, if a subsequent MI of one type occurs within 4 weeks, not necessarily Saturday through Sunday week, but a 4 weeks of a 28-day period of a myocardial infarction of a different type, we would assign the appropriate codes from category I21 to identify each type. We would not use the I22. Codes from category I22 are only assigned if both the initial and the subsequent myocardial infarctions are type 1 or unspecified. And of course, there are other different types of myocardial infarctions, or some of these terms you'll see are type 3, 4A, 4B, 4C, and 5. There are a lot of code first and code also notes that you'll see with these. So important to get those right by reading the documentation. Of course, there are very specific and explicit guidelines. So I'd caution you to read this section of guidelines with particular care, or you're going to be missing the wrong code or missing the right code and coding it incorrectly. That's what I mean to say. These include such things as hypertension with heart disease, hypertensive chronic kidney disease, hypertensive heart and chronic kidney disease, hypertensive cerebral vascular disease, and hypertensive retinopathy. Very specific guidelines that are chapter specific that are there. They're also covered in your textbook. And again, we have specific guidelines for intraoperative or post-procedural cerebral vascular accident, sequela of cerebral vascular diseases, and others. And there are other different types of myocardial infarctions. Type 1 myocardial infarctions are assigned at code categories I-21-0 through I-21.4. A type 2 myocardial infarction due to a demand ischemia or secondary to ischemic imbalance is coded to I-21.A1. And again, just a reminder, we don't assign codes I-24.8 dash whatever it is, other forms of acute ischemic heart disease for demand ischemia, right? Because we've already covered that in other codes. And the last slide here. If we have a type 2 acute myocardial infarction where the underlying cause is dependent on the circumstances of the admission, when the type 2 AMI is described as a non-STEMI or STEMI, we're going to only assign a code for I-21.81. And that's all I have for you. Please reach out if you have any questions about this material. Thank you. Bye now.